This is a story about an older man, a teenage boy, and the trouble they get into. It's a friendship you will not quite understand, and yet totally cheer for.
Hello.
Hey,
Hey
how
there.
are you?
I'm great. How are you two?
This is author Scott Semegran and narrator Brian Craig meeting me in Zoom to talk about Scott's new book, The Codger and the Sparrow.
We're doing
Okay.
great. Good to see you.
It's a story full of heart and hope and really interesting characters.
Okay, what do they look like? How do they stand? How do they move in the world? How do they smell? What is it that they're doing? What ticks do they have? I'm a people watcher. I like watching people. I'm curious about people, so I like to make those things kind of come into the scene. And so a lot of times, like with Big Dave, for example, the tow truck driver, he comes in, he smelled like WD-40 and wet and tobacco. And those are things that, I notice about people. I want my readers to see what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
So you heard narrator Brian Craig laughing and agreeing with Scott there. In AudioFile's review of this audiobook, Brian was praised for sharing these character stories with the, quote, perfect mix of wonder, empathy, and enthusiasm.
I love Brian. I love what he did for my audiobook. He brought me to tears so many times. I remember telling him that after, the book came out and he and I had talked over Zoom. There's still parts that when I hear it, it just moves me so much.
Yeah. Okay, so how does that make you feel, Brian?
I had only done two other fiction books before this. So most of my work is nonfiction, which, as you might imagine, is perfectly fine, but it can be difficult to have a real connection with what you're reading. And this one, I just really fell in with the characters and the rhythm of the writing and everything. And I think that's you can probably hear that in what I did. Or at least I hope so. So in that regard, hearing Scott say that means, yeah, I really did do my job and did it well. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. There's a lot to the story.
Mhm.
It happens in real time. So did this start with the old man? Did this start with the codger for you?
I love the story because I remember it like it was yesterday. But so in 2020, fall of 2020, when I first thought of the story, pandemic was going on, and my wife and I got in this habit that year where we would just wake up in the middle of the night probably from stress, or I'd think about where we're going to get toilet paper. Or, we had a couple of kids at home, and it was real late at night. I was by myself. I was on the couch with my cat, and I was petting her, and I just had this image of two guys in a car, an old guy and a young black kid, just driving somewhere in a car. But they looked really comfortable, like Hank had his hand up on the steering wheel, and the boy that would turn out to be Luis had his feet kicked out the window. And I was like, well, this isn't like a grandpa, grandson, or whatever. This is like, they look like two dudes, but they were vastly different in age. And that was very interesting to me because I like to write humor. And so it lent kind of an idea of like old white guy, young black guy. There's an odd couple dynamic there that can lend a lot of humor. So it really started with the both of them, not just Hank per se, but it was that image of like, I kept asking myself, why are they friends? Why do they seem like friends? That to me was kind of like the question that went through the whole book the whole time from beginning to end of why are these two friends? So, and that's just kind of where it all began. And it wasn't until I started developing their backstory. I spent a few months thinking about the story before I started writing. I do that with most of my books where I just kind of mull it over. I go on walks and I think about it. and asking that question, why are they friends? And then I was like, well, who are these people? And it was kind of thinking about their backstory, where it kind of developed who they were and where they came from. And I had written long, detailed backstories for both of them that eventually I just cut out of the novel because it was interesting to me, but it just seemed kind of cliched to just drop in the backstory. I'd done that in other books before, and I read it a lot in other novels where you just kind of stop and you get this long backstory. And I thought, well, it's not very interesting. And Luis's backstory was more about his mother than him. And I thought, well, am I the writer to write about a Puerto Rican woman's pregnancy and how that happened? It didn't really seem like I should do that.
Hmm.
And so I had done a lot of writing with that, and I threw it all out and wrote the 2 chapters for those characters of their problems remembering these past events. Those were the last 2 chapters I wrote. I had written the whole novel, and then I threw out about 10,000 words, and I went back and I thought, well, what would be an interesting way to tell their backstories without telling their backstories?
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, I'll just tell the reader what they have, which is not much. They have these fragmented memories. One's from a car crash, the others he can't remember far enough back. And I thought, well, I'm going to give the reader what they have. This kind of like repetitive, what happened kind of retelling that then becomes kind of like trance-like when you just kind of repeat it over and over. They're trying to figure out the details of these events that are very foggy. And I really liked that. It was really kind of hypnotic and like mantra-like to me, of trying to figure out who they were and then just giving the readers that little bit that they have, which is not
Yeah.
much, but it's
Yes.
what they
And
have.
I think everybody can relate to that, is how memory works, isn't it?
Mhm.
And also that sometimes in our retelling, I don't know that we cement things into place that weren't necessarily cement to begin with, you
Right.
know. But it's interesting to me that that is the audio. When I asked Brian, like, what would you like to feature? Would you like
Mm.
to hear in this episode? He went to those chapters.
Yeah. You know, those chapters are so well written. They're painting a picture, and it's the
Yeah.
experience. I mean, those 2 chapters were the 2 I enjoyed the most. There was something so deep and personal about those 2 chapters.
Okay, so here's a sample of one of the chapters Brian's talking about. This is from The Codger and the Sparrow, written by Scott Semegran, narrated by Brian Curtis. The audiobook was published by Vibrance Press, where Ron Lipkin did post-production.
Hank has performed this bedtime ritual so often that even on nights when he doesn't recite his mantra, the dream begins nonetheless. When the dream ends, he still wakes up in tears. When he is sober, he recites his mantra, falls asleep, and tries with all his might to have a dream with a different ending. When he is drunk and out of his mind, too inebriated to recite his mantra, the dream still comes, its madness more potent and unsympathetic. It's insanity, it's trauma, it's Hank's sorrow. The mantra is Hank's lullaby, the ending is Hank's regret. You're no fun, Linda tells him over and over again. Her declaration is in the damaged cranny of his mind. Hank desperately wants to tell her he's sorry, but he will never get the chance. He desperately wants to hug Tammy, but he won't get to do that either. But he has hope.
And they're written in present tense. The rest of the book is written in past tense. So the rest of the story is told like you're hearing a yarn, you're hearing a tale. And those 2 chapters are very immediate because they're told in present tense. Because you're hearing the scenes as they're happening. And so I thought, well, this would make more sense to pull out of how the narrator's been talking before. Because you're
Yeah.
not in the line of the story.
Mhm.
You're taking a detour. And that detour is a very different, and also it's very traumatic because those scenes are they're very sad compared to the rest of the
Yes.
story because it's their trauma that you're looking at.
Right. And that gets to the heart of what you said earlier. A great question as you sat down as an author about this is, why are they friends? And what has drawn them together? And
Right.
that's one of the biggest themes to me in the book, as a listener or reader, is that you start to see how they were sort of lost and find relationship and find community and humor with each other.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing, is that as friends, they have a certain way of interacting with each other that's not a paternal relationship type thing where there's like one respects the other. They see each other as equals, right?
Yeah.
And they kind of rib each other that way, because that's when I think of my friendships with other men, there's like a familiarity there that where if you're pranking them or ribbing them or joking with them, it's because you're so comfortable with them,
Yes.
right? And that's what they end up doing to each other, is they end up teasing each other, playing pranks on each other, saying things to
Yes.
each other, or what, where they're
Yes.
joking in a way that's because they're becoming very familiar with each other. They recognize each other.
Yes, yes, they see the common thread between each other, even though they are so different. And I do love the ribbing and the teasing and the pranking. Like, I think those are good words for the kind of humor that you write. I mean, it's not dark, and yet there is something just sort of edgy about the way that they prank each other. Without giving anything away, there's a prank that Hank pulls late in the book that is fairly dark, and yet really it's successful, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's effective.
Mhm.
And there's one earlier that we can talk about that has to do with marbles, um, which I thought was an interesting toy or element. There's
Mhm.
Luis has a blowgun thing, a blow
Right.
dart gun, and
Mhm.
marbles, and they're kind of an unusual, specific toy to have included in this story. Where did that come from?
Well, I always reminded myself that he's a boy, right? He's 16. He's not a man.
Yes.
And so, you know, I remember those years and having things like Rubik's cubes around, or pellet guns, or
Yeah.
marbles, or just any of those things. They're just around all the time. And it just made sense to me that he would just have some of these things, whether he was fidgeting with them, or there was just
Mm.
kind of like a nostalgic comfort to just having some of the stuff with him. And then it just kind of played into the story, whether he just happened to have a sack of marbles in his backpack. I just thought that was funny, because that's the way those teenagers are. They just are like that. My stepson, for a long time, in his backpack, he would have like sleeves of crackers and Dungeon and Dragons cards, and I'd be like, "Why do you have this stuff?" He's like, "It's important." I'm like, "Really?" Because that's just the way teens are. They're just
Yeah.
that's what they have. So, and that scene was funny to me because so they're both rascals, right? They're both
Mm.
rebels, Hank and Luis. And that was the first time that Hank got to witness Luis as being, he could be a little unhinged, right? Because
Yeah.
someone doing that could cause a lot of problems, but he had no qualms about doing it. And I think Hank was like, "Oh, I get this guy." That even later when they were out, and he kind of got mad at him, he didn't get mad at him for doing it. He was like, "You should tell me before you do something like that," right? He wanted to, and I think that's
I
where
need
the
to be in on
connections,
it. Yes,
right?
right.
That's
I
where
need
the
to be in on
connection
it.
started. Where, I mean, obviously from the beginning, Hank was someone you don't mess with, right? And was a loner and rebellious, but Luis just was seemed like a kid. But I wanted Hank to know he's a lot like you. He's a rascal too.
Yes, that's a great word, a rascal. They are a little rascally together. The marbles scene really caught me off guard. I did not expect it. And you set that scene in a really iconic gas station, which is not the right word for what a Buc-ee's is. Um, and and it's and all of it from the moment they walk through the door, again, we get this great imagery. We know exactly kind of how things smell and what things look like. Even if you've
Right.
never heard of a Buc-ee's, you're going to get a sense of the place from this description. And when he unleashes these marbles, um, in order to create a diversion and allow them to get to the front of the line for a sandwich, it is
Mm.
Yeah, it's funny. It's humorous. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great and I didn't think just until just now you explaining that about how it also is that moment of connection for the two of them over being a little rascally, like, hey, next time tell me you're gonna pull off
Yeah.
something like
Give me a
that.
heads up before you're gonna cause a ruckus, which
Mm,
is
But like
basically what Hank's trying to tell him, was that
mm,
it's all right, but just let me know next time,
yeah.
before you do
yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was really I loved the sense of humor. And I like that they shared a sense of humor.
Well, that was something that was important to me when I first talked to Brian, was making the point of that there's a real fine balance in my story that I tried to walk, which was there's some funny bits and there's a lot of drama, and they come in equal measure. I tried not to have one overtake the other, and
Mm,
that's where I thought Brian did a really great job of understanding that there are going to be points in the story where I do want the readers to laugh, and then there are other points where this is a solemn scene, and you need to kind of take it down a notch and just let it be that, because
yeah.
that's what they're dealing with. And Brian did such a great job of kind of like encapsulating that and bringing across in his narration.
I agree. I agree. There was a moment, Brian, more than once actually, but there was a moment. They're in a steakhouse sitting at the bar together, and
Mm,
there's an apprehension that starts to happen. Like there's a couple interactions with a couple other characters, and I started to feel unsettled. I started to feel like,
mm.
oh God, something bad is going to transpire with these characters, and that kind of that's not always easy to translate into audio. I don't think talking
Yeah.
about.
Oh, sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, look, I'm because I do stage acting, and and to me, I'm at the service of the playwright. So in this regard, I'm at the service of Scott and his story, and whatever he's given me, I'm going to try to convey as best I can, and
Yeah.
that's how I see my job.
Yes, I thought even though there wasn't anything overtly in the dialogue or in the description where you thought something bad was going to happen, there was a level of apprehension or anxiety happening at the potential for something
Mm,
to go awry.
right.
Um, and it's a delicate balance, I think, in the writing and the delivery there.
Yeah, I do like the balance between that tension and the seriousness of what these two are doing, in their individual quests. But you know, to get the kind of humor of real life in there at the same time,
Yeah.
is it's a gem. I appreciated that, and and as a narrator, it's just a matter of rolling with it, see what and
Yeah.
getting that across.
Yeah. I think one of the ways in the writing that it's achieved is that the listener and the reader is in on it. We're in on everything that's happening, and Scott has done this great thing where the characters lie pretty casually to the other
Mm,
people in their lives about what they're
yes.
up to. And so you just called it a quest, which I think is great because I hadn't thought about it with that term. But they are kind of both on a quest, and they end up, joining forces in their quest together. And they very nonchalantly uh, lie to the other people that are important in their lives about what they're up to. And
Yeah.
the reader, we know that. And you do have this sense of like, oh, they are going to get caught in this
Yep.
lie.
Yep.
uh yeah, and that is part of that tension. I think that you're just sort
Mm,
of you're anticipating what could go wrong.
right.
And I think there's something too about this, the way that you've played with that, Scott, this idea of lie and truth, and how they end up then revealing truths about themselves
Mm,
to each other, that gets to that big question of why they are friends. Yeah.
Hmm. Right. I think in a lot of ways, Brian and I are similar age. I think in a lot of ways, our generation's kind of wrestling with kind of like what we were taught masculinity was,
mm,
and what it was to be a
Mm,
man when we were younger, and we have these iconic images of, like the silent, strong type, and we realize that that's not really a great way to live your life, especially when you get older. You know, I think it's good for men to learn how to communicate their feelings and talk to other people, particularly other men, in a way that's not just, surface level. And I think that's what these two learn with each other, is how to talk to each other. And they're honest with each other. And you're right, they're not honest with other people in their life because they want to be left alone or they want to do other things. But with each other, they're very honest. I mean, they prank each other, but they're very honest with their feelings and what's happened to them,
Yeah.
and I appreciated that part of their relationship.
Yeah, I think that it stood out to me that they were very forthcoming with each other. And that is also another way, like you were saying, you didn't want to get too bogged down in backstory, but there are things that they say to each other that that give us glimpses into their past and who they really are, and their ideas about family. I know the other thing I wanted to ask you about, Scott, was there's the vehicle, the literal vehicle that they
Mhm.
use in their quest,
Right.
is pretty unique. So do you want to talk a little bit about the car?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been asked quite a bit about what in my life is part of this story. People always want, do I know someone like Hank or do I know someone like Luis? And the only thing I can say that is brought from my life is that car. My father-in-law, my wife's dad, who passed away in 2018, he owned that exact car. And he used to tell us stories about that car. And so
Mm.
Hank's story of acquiring that car is my father-in-law's story. He was in the military. He went off to
Mm.
Vietnam. He ordered the car. He went home, was told that it was in Amarillo, and he saw a news story that there was a tornado and there was a telephone pole that smashed his car. And he called um, the company and said, I want another one. They said, well, the only one we have with that engine is a pink one. And he said, send it to me. And it became he was in Montana. He was in Bozeman, and it became like his calling card. He had this hot pink hot rod. And so when anyone saw it, they knew that was my wife's dad, Ed Hoadley. And so he told us all these stories about, he had buddies that were police officers that used to try to chase him. They couldn't catch him. And just all these weird kind of insane. And so when he died in 2018, I told my wife, I said, one day I'm going to use that, his
Mm.
car story. And so when I was writing this one, having the vision of the old white guy and a young black guy in a car, I was like, that has to be Ed's car. So, and that was just a way to kind of memorialize how he used to talk about his car. And then plus it was just an interesting,
Yeah.
a very unique, specific car, like you said, where he loved that car. And, which is why he got so angry when it got messed up, is that it was very special to him. And that car was special to my father-in-law. He just told so many crazy stories about it. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big part of the story. There was another detail that stuck out to me, and that is that they both at different times correct other people about their names.
right.
Um, I think Hank wants to be Hank, not Henry.
Right.
And the same with our young character,
Mhm.
Did you purposefully weave that in? Because to me, the names that we have for each other, and the names become really important to who we are, to our identities, how they represent us as our background, right?
Right.
I thought it was slight. You did it with a slight hand, but it felt purposeful to me.
It was purposeful. It was one of those clues that people didn't know them, didn't see them.
Yes.
And so them just telling people, and a lot of people, even with Hank, just calling Luis Louis, it took him a while to kind of get it, which he admits it towards the end, that he should call him Luis, and it surprises him. And the same with, people call him, Henry or O'Sullivan, and it's also people just are not listening to him. They don't see him. And so that was just kind of their way of telling the world, this is who I am, and people are just
Yeah.
ignoring them. So,
Yeah. And there's sort of, family ties going back, like you mentioned, their backstory. And we open the book with humor for sure, but familial advice from a grandmother. We start
mhm,
the first chapter is really about Hank, and
mhm,
And her advice, and then it happens again in just even the second chapter. There's more advice about how to participate in your community, how to save your community, this sage grandmother advice.
Yeah.
So where did that come from, and why did you begin the book with that?
That's a good question. I don't know originally why. Um, I think just in being in kind of the storytelling mode of like, this is a yarn, I'm telling you a story. It just kind of made sense to me that there were things that happened before where I'm starting.
Yes.
And it was just kind of my way of saying, there are things that have happened. There are things about this man that and this is one of those things. But also that he just didn't understand some of the advice or the things that she would say. She would say these things that some of them were very practical and some of them were like, what does that even mean? And so he was still thinking about it, even as an old man, like, why did she say this thing to me?
Okay, so here's the sage advice handed down from Hank's grandmother that opens this story. Again, this is from The Codger and the Sparrow.
A wise old woman once told Hank, "The only two women who should ever bear witness to your pecker are your mother when you're a baby and your wife when you're married. Anyone else is just asking for trouble." This was, of course, Hank's grandmother who told him this, although he could never think of the reason why she told him this. He often thought of this nugget of wisdom, more so now that he was becoming as old as dirt day by day, whenever he had thoughts of other women besides his mother or his wife. Both were gone now, his mother and his wife, as well as his grandmother. But whenever he thought about a woman, he thought of what his Irish grandmother had told him. Trouble, he chuckled to himself. He rolled the question around in his mouth along with the last swig of a whiskey old-fashioned. Hogwash, he concluded.
To me, it was funny because although it is, I open with a penis joke, is that through the course of the story, Hank ends up not having clothes on in various scenes. He's
Yes.
become exposed, whether he's in jail or he wakes up and all of his clothes are off. He's had a wild dream. Not only is he exposing his heart to Luis, he's physically exposed quite a few times. He gets his penis stuck in a zipper in one scene. There's all kinds of things. And so I thought, well, this little thing that she said is funny because he's going to be kicked in the balls through the story, basically, several
Yes.
times, right? Life really comes at him. And so I just thought it was just a funny little familial thing to have.
It was. It
A
really
lot of
was,
people, if they
yeah.
get close with their grandparents or their great grandparents, they'll say these things, and you're like, what? What does that even mean? But it's just because they're from a different generation. So,
Yes. I think when I talk to storytellers, I'm always amazed at how those first lines, that opening, even the first sentence, that opening scene, it does, like you said, it sets a tone, it grabs our attention. That was a very effective, I thought, opening paragraph, opening scene.
yeah, I probably rewrote that first page 50 times.
Yeah.
It's like, I just want to hit a home run right from the start. I just really like a story that just grabs you from the start. Whether it's an interesting first sentence or even just an interesting first few paragraphs, you're like, oh, that's really, I just wanted to make an impression.
Yeah. I thought you did a great job. I thought it was very effective. It
Thank
definitely
you.
got my attention. I'm sure as you were reading it out loud, it was one of those things too, Brian, where you were like, now we know where we are. We know who we're
Right.
with. Yeah. It was
Right.
very descriptive.
Right. Well, I mean, as an actor, I think of what are the great opening lines in theater and in drama, so you think of Waiting for Godot, nothing to be done, or uh, things like that where it grabs you. But like Waiting for Godot, that first line leads into all this other stuff that you're going to learn about. As kind of coarse as it may seem, it's going to lead to a discovery of this really very layered person.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff going on there.
Yes. It is a tender story.
Yeah.
Even if it opens with a penis joke.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, was there anything that I didn't ask about that you wanted to make sure we talked about, Scott?
I don't know, Brian, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to talk about?
I just will say from just because I'm relatively new to voiceover, and I think I learned a lot about how to
Mm.
be a fiction narrator from doing this, and that's because I had a lot of stuff to work with, and so I appreciate that, and I hope that the listeners will take the opportunity to delve into this book, whether it's listening to me or just reading it, themselves, reading a print copy. Either way, I think for the first time, I kind of went on the journey with these people, and that
Mm.
was a good experience.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to describe how you feel at the end of an audiobook, is that you went on a journey. And this one was literally a quest and a journey.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Well, the name of this podcast is Desideratum, which is a reference to a poem that my parents had hanging on the wall when I was growing up called Desiderata. And it literally, in Latin, it translates to be what is desired as essential. What are the essential things? And for me, storytelling is essential. And I find great comfort in audio storytelling. So I like to ask the storyteller that I have join me, for you, what is most essential?
Well, I'll talk about this story specifically, but to me, the most essential thing in this story is connection and friendship with people.
Mm.
One of my favorite authors is Kurt Vonnegut, and I have this book of essays by him. And there's an essay where he talks about one of the worst things about growing old, it's almost like a curse, is loneliness. I don't know if you
Yeah.
guys have heard him talk about this, but he said that as he grew older, that was the hardest part for him, was isolation and loneliness. And so I kind of took that into this story of like, you're never too old, you're never too far gone to try to connect with somebody. And to me, that's kind of the essential nugget in this story is uh, friendship can be powerful. It can revive you and nourish you, and that you should look for them, even if you're in a point in your life where you don't have any. That there are people out there that you can connect with. It doesn't have to be necessarily be a romantic relationship. A friendship can be a powerful relationship in your life that has a lot of meaning and support. And I want people to know that.
I hope you enjoyed getting to know author Scott Semegran and narrator Brian Craig as much as I did. If you want to listen to The Codger and the Sparrow, I have an affiliate link to the audiobook platform Libro.fm. I partner with Libro.fm as my place to buy audiobooks because they support local bookstores. You can designate a local-to-you bookstore to support with every audiobook purchase you make. Right now, they have a Shop Small, Shop Local promotion running. You can get 3 audiobooks for the price of 1 when you start a new Libro.fm membership. I think you should start with Scott Semegran's The Codger and the Sparrow. I'll put the Libro.fm affiliate links that support this podcast in my show notes. Or you can reach out to me through my socials and I'll send the link right to you. In the next episode, I'm talking to Donna Allward about her historical fiction called When the World Fell Silent. Until then, thanks so much for listening.